Hello everybody, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again. I'm the host of Reformed GJ, and today I'm trying to do a fairly quick follow-up video on the Palmetto State Armory AKP. In my first video I talked about some of the issues that I had with it out of the box, some of the fixes that I did, and then how its performance was after that. After taking care of those issues, and after I took care of those issues, its performance was flawless, which is fantastic. In this video, I'm going to be talking about an upgrade that I've been trying to get into this thing, or into any AK that I own, and it just simply has not been working out well, and that has been the addition of a binary trigger. Those of you who are in the know, who know what you're looking at here, will know that I do have a binary trigger in this one right now. So it obviously has gone better than it has in the past. And I just wanted to inform you guys of where I am on that. In the past, I've been trying to work with the Fostech AK-47 binary trigger, and I really like the idea of the Fostech triggers because they have a device built into them that prevents the problem of hammer follow. Hammer follow is when the hammer falls too quickly in the firing cycle and the bolt is not all the way home, and so the hammer just basically kind of sits on the back of the bolt carrier as it's going forward, and it doesn't have enough force to set off the gun when it gets there, and so you basically wind up with a dead trigger. You still have a round in the chamber, and it doesn't do anything. You have to remediate the situation in order to get back to firing again. I wanted the Fostechs because they have a little device built into them that prevents that very problem. They prevent the hammer from falling too quickly. And the whole idea behind a binary trigger is to get something that can fire relatively quickly, but without major issues. The Fostech system really has gone a long way in trying to remediate some of those problems. But my Fostech trigger didn't fit either of my AKs, either the full-size one or this little AKP, and so I'm just sitting there looking at it going, well, it'd be really cool if it fit, but it doesn't fit in my palmettos very well. I'm not saying that it can't at all. I'm sure that with enough fitment you probably could, but I don't have a whole lot of time because I'm usually only home on the weekends, sometimes not, it depends on work schedule, but a lot of times I'm only home on the weekends, and I only have hand tools, so there's only so much fitment that I can do, and just never really had enough time to, or the proper tools to really more or less force the Fostech to fit my AKs. So I went another route, and I got the Franklin Armory binary trigger, and that's what's in this one right now. The reason why I avoided the Franklin Armory trigger in the first place was because they don't have that device in them that prevents the hammer follow issue. And when I took this thing out and tested it with this binary trigger in it, yeah, the hammer follow issue is definitely there. It is very possible to overrun the trigger and wind up with the hammer following the bolt home, the bolt carrier home, in which case it doesn't land with enough force to set off the gun, and you wind up with a dead gun that you're going to have to remediate, and it kind of takes away the fun of it. But at the same time, I knew that going into it, I expected that, and so I'm not overly upset about it. Excuse me. Not overly upset about it because I knew that that was going to be an issue going into it. And so in getting this trigger put in there, I wasn't trying to get something that I could, mag dump with super quickly. Once you get the cadence down, you can minimize the hammer follow issue, but if you want it to be 100% reliable in that regard, mag dumps are not really going to be the thing. Instead, if you want something that's going to be, well, 100% reliable is still debatable, but more reliable, a better use for a binary trigger would be something that would just simply give you quick follow-up shots. Basically a double tap kind of mechanism. Something that gives you 2 rounds relatively quickly without hopefully too much spread between them, that kind of thing. A double tap trigger, basically. And in that regard, I think that binary triggers have an application. And if you're talking about the Fostechs that prevent the hammer follow issue, then yeah, they become good for mag dumps and that kind of thing. But Franklin Armory triggers, With the hammer follow issue, not so much. They're not so good for mag dumps. But putting a couple of rounds in quick succession in a fairly tight spot, yeah, they can do that. And if you just focus on just the double taps and you don't try to do the mag dump, you're probably not going to have a whole lot of hammer follow issues either. It's not going to go away totally and completely, because it's a matter of just how fast you operate it, and the faster you operate it, the more likely it's going to happen. But if you keep it to just a couple of shots at a time, you're going to minimize the chances of that happening quite a bit. So that was the expectation going into it, and like I said, when I tested it, I put about 180 rounds through it. Yes, I did get that hammer follow issue. Part of that is just going to be learning the trigger and getting used to it and figuring out what cadence it does and doesn't need. But it does have another problem that I didn't anticipate it having, and I've got to say I'm a little disappointed with Franklin Armory for designing their trigger this way. Let me show you what I mean. It had the hammer follow issues, and I knew that Franklin Armory didn't have any device in their triggers to keep that from happening. I expected that. That's normal. But what I didn't expect to get was stovepipes. Out of the 180 rounds, I got about 4 or 5 stovepipes. And stovepipes usually happen when the bolt carrier is traveling to the rearward too slowly. You don't get really strong ejection, and so the case is left in the ejection port just kind of spinning until the bolt comes back home and closes on the case that is just spinning there. You don't have strong ejection, which means the bolt isn't going rearward fast enough. It's being slowed down somewhere along the way. And in this case, it's actually the hammer itself that is slowing it down. So let's see if we can look inside here. Okay, so right in here we have the hammer for the Franklin Armory binary trigger, and you'll see it's in 2 parts. You have the main part of the hammer up here, and then before it you have a little part of the hammer to which the hammer spring attaches, and you have a gap in the middle. That is what is causing this gun to have stovepipe issues. When the bolt carrier comes back, it's pushing that hammer down, and it pushes down on the little part first, the little part that the spring attaches to gets pushed on first, and then it has to jump that little gap and then push the rest of the hammer down. And that little gap is what is causing the problem. It jumps the gap, and the angle isn't a very good angle, and so it kind of seizes up on that part of the hammer, gets slowed down, and that causes the stovepipes. And so I have adjusted the height of the trigger to try to minimize that issue as much as I could. I took the trigger and I stuck it just as low as I possibly could in the receiver, which is a nice feature of the Franklin Armory trigger system, in that you can adjust the height, unlike the Fostec. Well, technically with a Fostec, if you have a Dremel or something like that, or just a lot of time, patience, and hand tools, I guess you could do it too. But the Franklin Armory trigger actually has some built-in mechanisms to help you adjust the height. It's basically 2 screws. One of them is a screw that goes through the handle of the AK, and then there's another screw that basically goes the opposite direction. So between those 2 screws, you get to determine where the height of the trigger pack is going to be. So right now, I have it set as low as it will possibly go, and then I did what I pretty much do with my AKs in general, is that I took out a file and tried to soften up that little edge just as much as I could. And now it does seem to cycle a little bit better. Still hangs up a little bit though. Let me see if I can show you what I mean. So go ahead and pull. I'm going to change sides here. Alright, so go ahead and pull. And then as I'm bringing it back, a little bit of resistance. There's the catch, quite a bit more resistance. Eventually pushes it down. It's better than it was, but I can still feel a very definite resistance right at where that gap is, and it's more resistance than I get anywhere along the rearward travel of the bolt carrier. That is definitely the high point. It's better than where it was. But it still maxes out there, and that concerns me. I haven't had the chance to test it since I made those changes, since I lowered it and tried to soften up that edge a little bit, so I don't know if it fixed it or not. We'll see the next time I go out if that resolves the issue. But 4 or 5 stovepipes out of 180 rounds is a lot better than I was getting with the Fostek when I did have it in the guns. It would be malfunctioning like every other round, and so it's definitely better than that, but it's still a long way from perfect. And this goes back to the whole issue of binary triggers in general and how useful they are or are not. Like I said, with the Fostek ones, if you can get them to work, the fact that they prevent hammer follow is nice, and maybe there's something there. Franklin Armory ones, though, they have the hammer follow issue, and in this particular case, I'm getting stovepipes, means that defensively I really would be very reticent to recommend it. That being said, it is fun when it's working properly. It is a good range toy in that regard, and a lot of fun for other people to play around with and mess with. But at this point, I just don't trust it very much, and so no, I wouldn't recommend it for self-defense use. And like I said, with hammer follow issues, it's not really even all that great for mag dumps, but what it does do is it does put 2 rounds in a relatively tight circle relatively quickly, provided you're not too terribly far away. And I've got this gun set up for basically close quarters type stuff. Not that I ever really plan on using this one in a defensive manner. This is mostly just recreational. But at relatively close distances, say 20-25 yards, yeah, you can keep both shots inside of an 8-inch circle with a binary trigger. And that's cool, that's wonderful. But my assessment of it is that the binary triggers, when it comes to the Palmetto State Armory GF3 pattern guns, and the AKP is patterned after the GF3, it's just a shorter version of the same thing, is that they're either going to require a whole lot of fitments, or they could wind up being finicky, etc., etc. I just wouldn't recommend them for any kind of serious use. And there's lots of people that would say the same thing when it comes to binary triggers. But the reason why I have one and why I've wanted one so much is mostly just because the powers that be don't like them. It's not because they're overly practical. It's not because they're overly effective necessarily. It depends on what you're putting it in and how much fitment work you're willing to do and those kinds of things. I wouldn't say, though, that they're overly practical or anything like that. It's mostly just because it ticks certain people off, and for me, as an American, that's a good enough reason to own it. Being an American is awesome. Next year that may all change, but for right now, I will enjoy the freedoms that I have while I have them. So anyways, that's where I am. I found a binary trigger that fits into the GF3 pattern guns and the AKP specifically, but it's still not perfect. I made some changes, haven't seen if they wound up fixing the problems yet, but time will tell. In any case, thank you all very much for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. Bye.